So I know everybody was expecting a really boring talk, and I hate to be a disappointment, but I've got something kind of excited going on here. Everybody knows I'm really passionate about my hatred of bananas, but there's actually a lot of importance to bananas. Like I'm not a banana fan, but there's a huge amount of socioeconomic impact with bananas, which is what the brunt of my talk is about, but I'd fill in some details as well as we go. Bananas actually originate from Australia and Indo-Mayala, so sort of ranging from like Afghanistan through India and down into the islands. And there's not a lot of varieties of bananas that we eat in like the Western world. There's tons of varieties, but most of them aren't food products. A lot of them are really just decorative. And you note, it'll be important later, that they reproduce both asexually and sexually, so like a normal plant, but you can also take cuttings of them, which is how modern banana production works. A few other random facts. Bananas are herbaceous, so they're not trees. They're an herb, and the fruit is actually a berry. Like I said, they're grown decoratively. The tears in a bunch, how they kind of go in rows, are called hands. They're really wet. A bunch of other odd, little facts that aren't of any particular importance. Bananas versus plantains seems to be a thing that I've heard discussed here at least 4 or 5 times because we have normal conversations. They're actually the same thing. Plantains are just a savory banana. In the rest of the world, they're not two different things because everywhere else they have like an in-between state. So there's not just one or the other. There's a whole gradient. Here's where it starts getting fun. So bananas, there's a lot of talk about bananas being high in potassium. Potassium, to some degree, has naturally occurring radioactive isotopes. So in the 90s, somebody got smart and decided we'd start describing dosages of radiation in terms of bananas. It was actually for the RadSafe mailing list, which is for like the Illinois University or some university in Illinois mailing list on radioactive security and making sure you don't get radiated to death, because that's a big concern in Illinois. Unfortunately, for this guy, your body sort of regulates how much potassium you have. It'll store extra. It won't keep too much extra. So it's not particularly relevant, really. But it's just it's sort of a fun little thing about bananas. And so that leads us to the whole conversation about bananas being high in potassium, and they're a decent source of potassium, but they're not like this potassium wonder fruit like people make them out to be. They average, an average Cavendish banana that you get at the store is around 400 milligrams of potassium. They're
Go back to that previous slide. So that they're not a great source of potassium. It says lots of foods with more potassium.
They're a decent source of potassium. Like they're not like lacking in potassium. Sort of like you don't get protein. It's not like soda and protein. There's potassium in bananas, enough to get by, but it's not like people always talk about, oh, bananas, you get all your potassium that way, and it's like that's not the case. They're a decent source, but like potatoes average like, depending really on the potato, like 600 to over 1,000 milligrams of potassium per potato for just like a standard russet potato. And there's a bunch of other ways you can get way more, including Brazil nuts, but those also have radon. Don't eat Brazil nuts, I guess. Now, the banana we eat every day that you see at the grocery store, standard long yellow banana, is called the Cavendish. And it's named after William Cavendish, who got the first sort of cutting of this plant and made it popular. There's a lot of the other bananas you get are technically not Cavendish bananas. They're from some other grower, but it's genetically pretty much the same fruit. And literally half of the bananas just about in the entire world that are grown are of this type for exports to the Western world. And they're starting to become vulnerable to what's called Panama disease, which is a fungal disease. It almost took out bananas between the 20s and the 50s. Didn't quite get there, unfortunately for me. But at the time, it was the Gros Michel banana. And it was so destructive that it pretty much took all the American fruit companies almost out of business. And a lot of them shut down. There were songs about it, all kinds of chaos going on. And finally, they switched to the Cavendish banana because that was resistant. But now that's starting to be affected by new forms of the disease. And there's a lot of stuff going on. Like there was just an article in Forbes about it because it's as silly as it sounds, it's actually a relatively large financial impact. Now here's sort of the important stuff about bananas. Bananas have a lot of political importance, which sounds silly, but they're one of the most important food crops in developing countries. They're actually, like, some types of bananas in Africa provide more food per square meter than any standard cereal does. So especially in Africa, that's like the primary food product that cakes, breads, everything are made out of. By volume, it's the #1 largest fruit. As far as financial goes, it's #2 after citrus. I guess citrus is all grouped together when taking like financial measures of that kind of stuff. And last year, or in 2006, the total exports were valued at over $5.8 billion in bananas. The main importers are the USA, the EU, and then Japan, all Western, sort of Westernized anyway, countries. But there's a lot of issues related to like work environment and like fair trade. Wages are exceptionally low, stuff like that. There's still a lot of dangerous like working conditions. And bananas have historically been tied to really heavy corruption in developing countries. Sounds ridiculous, but it's totally true. Hence the term banana republics, which was coined by O. Henry in his book Cabbages and Kings. It's generally a developing economy that's dependent on a single export, like bananas. And the US government, especially in like the 60s and 70s, had a huge hand in maintaining these economies and preventing them from developing further. There was actually a name for it. It's called the Banana Wars. And the US did a lot of installing dictators, a lot of CIA-sponsored union busting, stuff like this, all over protecting fruit companies. There's other crops involved, like tobacco and sugarcane, but we used that as like a big excuse to go in and maintain our sphere of influence as well with the whole Cold War. There's a whole list of places we invaded. Sometimes we just maintained occupations for 30 years at a time, literally over protecting US corporate interests for fruit companies. Specifically, we paid the most attention to the United Fruit Corporation and Standard Fruit Company, which became Dole and Chiquita. Honduras was particularly bad with a whole host of invasions. The Banana Republic was actually coined, like the guy who wrote about that spent time in Honduras, and that's what he modeled that whole term after. And that's where that term that we use today comes from. As far as corruption that was involved, there was a lot of wage fixing, exclusivity contracts. So the fruit companies managed to take complete monopolies over entire sectors of government, mail, food provisions, all kinds of stuff. And there was heavy political fixing. We installed a lot of dictators, especially in Honduras and Guatemala, multiple times. And we did a lot of union busting. Like I mentioned here, Jorge Ubico had several hundred union members killed in 2 days, and he had CIA assistance for that. If you ever want to not sleep, go ahead and read about American involvement in Latin American history. It's a great time. So Ed Whitman, president of United Fruit Company for a time, was married to his wife, Anne, who was Eisenhower's personal secretary, and they were very close to one another. They talked a lot. They were good political friends. And he produced a video that the US distributed called Why the Kremlin Hates Bananas. And it was all about how, by supporting union busting in Honduras specifically, you would be fighting against the Kremlin. By buying more bananas from United Fruit Company, you were doing your part to stop communism. Because you gotta help the big companies make a buck, right? And so, I mean, bananas, it's, kind of a joke. I kind of picked it as a joke topic, but there's a lot of important stuff to know about there because there's a lot of US history involved, and there's a lot of understanding as to why we get a bad, people might shoot you a dirty look when you go abroad to places, and that's because we've done this in a lot of developing economies. So as a summary about bananas, there's not as much potassium as they claim. They're underpriced due to fair work conditions. They're 5 cents a banana or something. They're gross. They're potentially going extinct anyways, thanks to Panama disease. So they're actively looking for a new type of banana to replace our current bananas with. And why are there so many bananas in the office? Nobody has ever been able to explain this to me. No, wrong. So they're a decent source of potassium. So that's it. I could go into a lot more detail about things, but I didn't want to get too like lecture-like. So if anybody had any questions, I can answer them. But